I would like to call Charles Hernick up to the stage and Dave Banks and other folks who are going to speak about a new initiative trying to get some coordination on the policy front down in Washington.
Why did we join the coalition? Well, first of all, Rod is a very good salesperson, right? And I've got and I'm surrounded by friends.
Quiet, everybody's complimenting me.
Is that something new for you?
I'm going to take it when you can get it.
No, look. It's absolutely crucial that we think outside of the box. Okay, we've got a real. Everyone knows how dysfunctional Washington is. I will say, really quickly that I know a lot of people love to look at big policy solutions, at a national scale. I think some people on the panel alluded to the fact that it's probably a suite of policies and measures that we'll have to choose from. I certainly believe that free market solutions are absolutely essential to that effort. I am concerned about the rise of state-owned enterprises in the global economy, right? Because if you look at the trajectory, they're going to become more and more of a factor. So I'm not quite sure, from a global policy perspective, what a free market approach does. Okay, and I will say before I miss my appointment that I do think it's important for us to talk about the contours of a political compromise within the GOP. Right? We haven't had that discussion within the Republican Party. We all know that we've got a problem with the GOP and climate. I don't think we should run away from talking about climate change and the science. But I think it's easier. It would be much easier for the Republican Party, from a red state, rural perspective, to be able to talk about climate if we approach climate change policy the way the Europeans did, right? And I was in Brussels for a while, and I studied a lot when it came to EU climate policy. Why does the EU have a continent-wide climate policy? And it's because of the political compromise that they worked out between rich member states and poor member states, okay? And then they were able to move forward with a set of policy solutions. I think we need to have that type of conversation here in the United States. The difference between poorer and richer states. Poor states need an easy compliance pathway. I think those poor states, and I'm not saying they shouldn't do anything. It should be a start and strengthen approach, right? There needs to be a heavy agricultural component to the policy, and I'm a big advocate for soil quality. But anyway, I'll pass it on. Otherwise, I will have defeated my purpose of.
Dave, I think that's a good transition to our panel
Absolutely.
and next conversation. Well scripted.
Thank you very much.
I'll see you guys at the reception.
Awesome.
Oh, back for cocktails. That's better. Oh yeah.
I'm a Washington swamp.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. Charles?
Thanks, Hallie, and thanks, Rod, for convening this conversation. My name is Charles Hernick. I'm with Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. I kind of like that people are milling in the back. Let's keep this casual and proceed as a conversation. And in just a few minutes, I'll invite the rest of the panel to come up here and discuss, because that's really what this is. And thank you, Rod, for your leadership. And I'm here to introduce the Clean Capitalist Coalition. I just got off the phone with Inside EPA, which is a very DC-centric and obviously Environmental Protection Agency focused news outlet. But they're interested in what we're doing with the Clean Capitalist Coalition. The basic focus, and as Dave just mentioned, is that we need some new ideas. We need more ideas out there to deal with the issues that are facing us. And I pulled this cartoon from The Economist. I love some of The Economist cartoons. And here's our capitalist getting bit by one dog and then licked by the other dog. And I think that it's instructive of how we are these days. Every once in a while, I'm surprised I read a poll. Socialism is up, especially with young people. And it's astonishing to me. It drives me a little bit crazy, and it's frustrating, but it's understandable. How many people here in this room are here in part because they think that climate change is real and we should do something about it? Show of hands and some clapping. That's good. No laughter, fortunately. The truth is that capitalism, as it's been going, hasn't done enough to meet the greenhouse gas emissions targets that I think that we do need. And what I'm here to talk about today is one policy proposal that I'll share with you, and then pull up some of our additional coalition members who are interested in that competition of ideas and speeding that vetting process and that discussion process in DC, but also nationally, to figure out what we can be doing better to improve policy outcomes, to use capitalism as the mechanism and key driving force for achieving good and solving the real key problems that we have ahead of us. Environmental issues being primary, climate change being the one at the tip of the tongue right now. But Rod, what I appreciate about the group of folks that you've pulled together here is that includes other perspectives, conservation writ large, oceans, and the health of our oceans, and dealing with another pollution problem that is right there on the horizon in terms of plastics. The good news, if I can get this to work, it was working earlier. If- It was on. Now it's on. All right, if you could just hit next slide for
Can
me.
you be the mic lady? Just give the mic if anybody wants.
This will slow us down. The good news is that I'm not alone. You all in this room are not alone. The Clean Capitalist Coalition is a new organization that was just launched yesterday. We're just standing on our feet. But it's it's 14 different organizations that have come together to discuss capitalism, the core principles of reducing barriers, reducing taxation to the greatest extent possible, and creating a level playing field for technologies, clean technologies, to be able to compete and create the environmental results that we're concerned with. It's organized around 4 common principles. The principles are up here, and as I just described, focused on reducing regulatory barriers, maintaining a level playing field, and focusing on those better outcomes. We're starting with just a few policy ideas to move forward with and discuss. We talked about clean tax cuts, clean asset bonds. We're going to continue that conversation over the course of today. I'll focus a little bit on this voluntary federal framework for greenhouse gas emissions as another policy idea. But this is just one of many, and I'm inviting the rest of the panel up here to help share their interests, their perspectives, and how they intend to work in the coalition to help advance some of the ideas that they've been working on in their organization to help to speed this process, because I think that that's the big thing, and you get that from a raising of hands and the applause, is that there's a sense of urgency for what we need to accomplish, and we need to make these modifications to our capitalist system sooner than later. Otherwise, those polls will continue, and those trends will continue, and the youth will continue to be disenfranchised, and we don't want that. So my organization, CRES Forum, has been working on a policy proposal that is a voluntary federal framework for greenhouse gas emissions and offsets tracking. So this is essentially establishing a federal, a light federal touch to help aggregate what has otherwise been happening at the national level by corporations, by municipalities, and it's a lot. This slide here, with the font way too small for you to actually be able to read, shows some of the highlights. Apple, 100% renewable. Yesterday I learned for every text that you send, for every page that you download, if you're on an Apple product, that's coming from 100% renewable power. That's pretty fantastic. And every day I open up the Wall Street Journal, and it seems like there's another corporation doing something in terms of increasing their commitment to renewables, doing something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Walmart committing to reducing 1 billion tons of CO2 by 2030 from their supply chains and from their operations. That's huge. The capacity of the private sector is large, and it's working already. And in fact, that the US isn't doing anything is wrong too. You can look at this slide here, and while what you see is California, some of the New England states, as a part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, working together, The idea that we're starting from whole cloth from federal policy isn't true at all. States have been leading and working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for over a decade, and the results have had a major impact. Greenhouse gas emissions are at their lowest point in the last 2 decades. That's a big deal, and we need to be able to continue that trajectory by establishing a framework that works with states and doesn't supersede them. It's a key challenge with a carbon tax. A carbon tax is great from an economist standpoint. It's a Pigouvian tax, and it will help move the needle and change prices. But in terms of from a federalist standpoint, there are major implementation challenges if you have 1/3 of the economy, and if you take the New England states, the Mid-Atlantic states, plus Virginia and New Jersey, who have committed to New Jersey to rejoin the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, Virginia to join for the first time. With those states, that's 1/3 of the U.S. economy, already under a cap and trade system. For a decade, they've been doing it. So to come in and think that the federal government is going to come and work from whole cloth and drop down a carbon tax or drop down something else, it's going to have to work for the states. And so what we're proposing is a framework that builds off of what states have already been doing, builds off of what municipalities have already been doing, and a lot of folks are already reporting. But what's it adding up to? Do you know that Delta Airlines already reports their emissions and they've focused on reducing them? Exelon, Postal Service, Hershey, University of California System, the list goes on and on. It's hundreds of companies that have been on their own, for their own reasons, recording their emissions, reporting them, and trying to drive them down. That's a pretty big deal. And if we can establish a federal mechanism for aggregating that and providing some assurance in the same way that, you can buy any organic product, but if it's a USDA certified organic product, that gives you some assurance that it's been through a more legitimate process. Same way that Energy Star drove the market to invest in energy efficiency and has had a magnificent effect, such that we've reached a decoupling of the U.S. economy. It used to be from the beginning of time, to get more out of the economy, you had to use more energy. That stopped 10 years ago. And since that point in time, we've been able to steadily grow our economy and reduce energy use to the point that U.S. energy use is declining because of energy efficiency. A voluntary framework can help guide capital markets, help guide investments by showing that, by establishing, validating what people are doing on their own accord. The fact that everybody raised their hand in this room to talk about, that they knew about climate change, that they knew that they should do something, is different than where we were 15 years ago when I first started following the climate change conversation. A carbon tax, a single federal price for carbon, rests on the assumption that we need the government to internalize that externality, as the economists say, because people can't do it on their own. The people in this room sure have it on their radar, and it may vary in your minds what the level of effort is and how much it's worth in your mind to reduce emissions or sequester emissions or whatever it is. But there's a lot there, and a lot of companies have their own carbon pricing. These states have their own carbon pricing, and we should allow for that. Different prices are fine. It costs me something different to buy a burger here in Manhattan than it does in Minnesota, where I grew up. I don't know that there should be a single price for carbon, either globally or here in the US. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I've got that single price. But what I do know is that there's a lot of municipalities, over 3,000, that have made commitments that they're still in to track and reduce their emissions, and we should help aggregate that. That's a good role for the federal government. The other point on this slide focuses on offsets. You don't have to be able to read all of the numbers, except for all of the average prices for these offsets. And so, just real briefly, a carbon offset is so that if I can't reduce my emissions, but Nick over here can plant some trees and sequester it, or can turn the smokestack upside down on an industrial source or on a coal-fired power plant, and he can put it underground. If he can do that, I can buy a credit from him and I offset my emissions. In the voluntary market for offsets, prices are all below $10. And when you hear the economists and you hear the proposals for cap and trade, or you hear the proposals for a carbon tax, it's always higher than that. And when the numbers came out for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and they were focusing on, well, we need a $25 per ton price, $35 per ton price, for almost the whole time it's been trading at less than $15 per ton. It's been cheaper every time. When markets are able to solve the problem on their own, that price is driven down. And it's already low in the voluntary offset market, and we should build off of that. So our proposal is simple, and it's twofold. Number one, establish a mechanism for federal reporting. Anybody that wants to opt in can do it. A municipality, a private sector company, those states that are already doing it's easy. Just forward that on to the federal government. Why would you do that? Well, it provides some assurance in the same way that companies file SEC reports and they just get filed away in a cabinet, that you're not going to lie to the federal government. And that's simple enough. To focus on that as a mechanism for compliance and transparency could be helpful and could help drive emissions down and drive investment into this sector. And then the other thing, too, is consistent and standardized rules for offsets. We know that there's a lot of criticism of offset markets that have happened over the decades, and that's fine and valid. The Chicago Climate Exchange that focused on terrestrial sequestration for like farm projects failed, went belly up. There wasn't enough volume and there was too much risk, and crunching the numbers was just too much work. It's not going to be easy to generate offsets from all sources, but it will be in some cases. And when those cases are easy and valid, we should focus on it. And in fact, an important player entered this field just this year. The federal government, through the 45Q tax credit, is putting a substantial sum of money available so that folks who want to try to turn a smokestack upside down, capture CO2 and inject it underground, either for enhanced oil recovery or for permanent sequestration, can get a tax credit to do that. You all, who are paying federal taxes, are helping to subsidize this. You're essentially buying offset credits. The market hasn't been fully established yet. The rules still need to be figured out, but it's a lot that does need to be figured out. And so we will, this is part of the process that we want to shape over the next few months. So basically this framework that we're proposing supports states' rights to do what they want to do, supports and activates what corporations have already been doing, and builds off of that instead of trying to supersede it and imagine that the U.S. government can work from a whole cloth. That's the one policy idea, and there will be more. And I think that that's why the Clean Capitalist Coalition is interesting and meaningful, and I would encourage for you all to follow what we're doing. If you're interested in joining and participating, join the conversation. I'm trying to back up to the slide where we have our members.